I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I don't want to set this up too much because I'm interested to hear what the speaker's saying. We've only got an hour. The only thing I'd say about the issue of cultural boycotts and artistic freedom is that artistic freedom is sometimes assaulted not by explicit censorship. And cultural boycotts are peculiar because they're actually often orchestrated by people who are involved in culture and arts themselves, who are calling for other artists and cultural figures to be boycotted, which is a weird one. And the example used in the blurb for this session is extraordinary, which is that the actions of people in the literature world called for the ending of sponsorship by Baillie Gifford of book festivals at both Hay, who backed off, and Edinburgh Book Festival that backed off. And I've spoken at both, and we used to organise as the Academy of Ideas events at the Edinburgh Book Festival. And as a consequence, they've lost the sponsorship for book festivals throughout the United Kingdom, and now it's likely to mean that there will be no book festivals in this country in a substantial numbers in the future, because who's going to sponsor from the corporate world those kind of festivals? And it was publishers and writers who called for those boycotts. It's just a weird one, let alone the BDS stuff, which is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions associated with the whole Israel and boycotting Israel issue, which are widely supported, particularly amongst students, and they often have a cultural form. That will do as a way to sort of approach it and think, how weird is that? I'm going to introduce the panel very quickly. So we've got Wendy Earle sitting next to me. Wendy is the convener of the Arts and Academy of Ideas Arts and Society Forum. You've actually got a new podcast, which they've just launched, and actually on this very issue. She's also the author of an excellent essay on beauty entitled Lifting the Spirits in 5 Critical Essays on Beauty, which you should have a look at. We've then got Denise Fahmy, who is the co-founder of a new campaigning organisation, Freedom in the Arts, which I think has been a particularly important new formation that's come out and has actually recently launched a manifesto, which is excellent, in which we at the Academy of Ideas are just featured. But when you read the whole manifesto, it's exactly the sort of thing that I think people in the arts should be thinking about. I'm hoping will have a really big impact. Denise herself is a visual arts specialist, and last year she won an employment tribunal against the Arts Council of England, where she'd worked for 15 years, in terms of the harassment at work that she received for her gender critical beliefs. And then last but not least, we've got Matilda Martin, who is an undergraduate student in English at Oxford University and a tutor of both school and home educated children, and is somebody who's participating in this summer school, and as Alistair has wanted to try and get as many people who are participants on panels, I'm delighted Matilda joined us. Give them a warm welcome.
Okay, I thought I'd just focus on trying to explain why cultural boycotts are a form of censorship, or an attack on freedom of expression. And it was brought home to me recently. I saw a play in London, Islington, London, which really brought home why it's important not to attack freedom of expression, not to limit it. So this play, it's called Alma Mater, and it's directed by Polly Findlay and at the Almeida Theatre in Islington. And it dealt with sexual politics in university, a little bit passé now, I guess, with all the kind of Gaza stuff. But I think the play was very successful in expressing the deep tensions within the Me Too debates and the discussion about rape culture. And the reason why it was successful, I think, is because of the way it was developed and written. The narrative centred around a conflict between 2 feminists, an older women's rights campaigner and a young activist of the Me Too generation. And they're set up with a drunken encounter by 2 students, a female first year and a male third year student. And the narrative unfolded around how to respond to this encounter. The young feminist was a student welfare officer and insisted that rape had occurred in this encounter because the students involved had been drunk. The older feminist, who had recently been appointed as the first ever female master of this elite institution, she was reluctant to assume the young woman was automatically a victim. The brilliant, really excellent script by Kendall Fever elaborated the different viewpoints in an emotionally charged but a very rational and intellectually coherent way, as the destructive consequences of the rape allegations started to spread in a febrile atmosphere through the campus. And the performance by the small cast they were excellent performances, which sort of really evoked very three-dimensional characters involved in this dispute. Although the women attracted the biggest share of the audience sympathy, for sure, there was also a sense of sympathy for the situation that the men found themselves in that sort of rape culture atmosphere. So I think the production did what the arts do best, which is to really address and explore complexity, and to do that in a way that was intellectually and emotionally engaging. And the audience was sort of like simultaneously enthralled, discomforted, torn, challenged, but also entertained. It was a really enjoyable, if you know what I mean, show. It very, very kind of engaging. So it set me thinking, what if this production had been cancelled because of a cultural boycott? If, for example, the performer's writer or director had been caught out with some kind of dodgy tweet on the wrong side of the polarising political discussion, or if a sponsor had had some shady connection with Israel or BP or Big Pharma or whatever, the audiences would have been denied exposure not only to an inspiring work of art, but also to new insights into this complex and divisive still contemporary issue. And think of the potential loss that would have had to public understanding as well as to artistic achievement. I think cultural boycotts effectively block free expression for artists, but also the capacity for audiences to decide for themselves what is important and what the issues are at stake. Ever since Caravaggio and Shakespeare, so a good 500 years, is it? Yeah. Social and political issues have often, though not always, constituted the focus for artistic works. However, when artists bring these issues, what artists bring to these issues is exactly what the writer, director and performers brought to the Alma Mater show performance, a sense of the complex mix of emotions and ideas in our political, personal and social lives. The sense that human beings can be confused, creative, destructive, stupid, misguided, inspired, brave, cowardly, and that we do and that what we do and the way we think and how we relate to each other can sometimes be very difficult to fathom. Cultural boycotts are opportunistic, simplistic and reductive in my view. They reduce and narrow the scope of human interaction and how we work out how we want to live in this world and how we want to think about things. They assume the lowest level of public intelligence and knowledge. Hannah Arendt, who you've encountered in this today already, argued that one of the most significant contributions to the rise of fascism was the failure of active thought. That is, to engage in thoughtful action. When people allow themselves to be led by the rightful force of the moment and are afraid to resist that force, they allow themselves to be chained in a very particular and narrow worldview, and arguably allow immorality and evil to thrive. Artists at their best contribute to our ability to think about things in Arendt's sense. Artists who participate in cultural boycotts betray the very essence of their mission to create spaces and catalyse free thinking. They show themselves to be trapped in narrow, single-issue, catastrophic thinking that limits our capacity to act wisely and thoughtfully. And I think that's what the authors who sided with the boycotts, I think that's what they did in literary festivals, and they should be condemned for it.
Okay. That's very useful, Wendy, and I now want to go see the play. Anyway, right there, Denise.
Sorry. Okay, so My name's Denise, and we run an organisation called Freedom in the Arts, and this is our manifesto. And we published it a couple of weeks ago and are sharing it with the new government and peers, etc., and people working in the arts. When I say we, I mean myself and my colleague Rosie Kay, and both of us experienced, I guess, a form of boycott by our colleagues, and which you could is cancellation, but that is essentially boycott. And we ended up, Rosie lost her company because she was bullied essentially, and the company collapsed, and I lost my job in a public funding agency. So it's kind of a form of cancellation, and at the basis of that cancellation was bullying. You know, there was a veneer of politics, but really it was bullying, because we can all share politics without necessarily attacking those who we don't agree with. So from that we set up Freedom in the Arts, and one of the principles that we debated for some time was whether or not we supported boycotts, and this was before essentially what you might call kind of boycott season kicked off this year in 2024. And we decided we didn't support boycotts. Now, that isn't an easy position to always hold. And actually, in this discussion, I think I'm going to skirt round all of those issues, because I still don't actually know if I hold that position. But the reason we chose it as an organisation was because our priority in that organisation is to support artistic freedom. And artists need to be able to express themselves, audiences need to be able to come and see work, and we also need artistic engagement between artists of different views and communities of different views, and art allows that to happen. Because artistic freedom is our priority, we do not support boycotts. But that is not to say that individually, personally, there aren't all kinds of complexities around what is a boycott. Now, when we talk about cultural boycotts, they have lots of different manifestations, because the arts is a public realm. The whole experience of the arts is the public square. And that's why it's always attractive for boycotts. If you're going to develop a campaign, hone in on an art gallery, which everybody can get into for free, or most of them, it is the public square. And for that reason also, that's why we have public sponsorship and we have corporate sponsorship, similarly, because it's the public square in which you can put across your company's corporate ideals. So cultural boycotts have come in all shapes and forms. So in this one at Baillie Gifford, artists demanded the end of sponsorship. The events at the British Museum, it's not artists necessarily, it's activists around kind of green policies that are demanding the end to the BP relationship with the British Museum, which British Museum has stuck by, and I think has received the largest corporate sponsorship from BP so far, at about 50 million over, I think, 5 years. So that's one type. Now, artists withdrawing work is another type of so we saw that at the Barbican recently, when 9 or 10 artists withdrew their work from the Barbican in an exhibition there. What was it called? Something to do with textiles, wasn't it? And that led to staff withdrawing their time as well, and staff went on strike at the Barbican. And when I say strike, it wasn't a legal strike in the terms that are set out in the Trade Union Act. They just left. And it wasn't through unionised activity. It was, again, an action by people that work at the Barbican who are cultural workers. And then there have been other types of, this is the arts. Nothing's kind of clean and ordinary. So often boycotts are actually part of the art. So protest is part of work. So, thinking about, when was it? 1985, you may know the artist Carl Andre. You might know him because he made bricks for, I think it's first shown at Tate Britain, maybe. before Tate Modern, and it was minimal work, and it, you know, became a kind of one of those types of artworks that the Daily Mail wrote about as modern art gone mad. You know, now that his exhibition in America was eventually boycotted through other artists coming into his show and having a mass cry-in to boycott his work because his wife had died in controversial circumstances and he was acquitted of second-degree murder. And so female artists came into his space, other artists, and basically cried for weeks until eventually the gallery closed the exhibition. So there's all kinds of boycotts that happen in the arts that that sometimes they can almost go into pranks. So now what comes about as a result of that? Now what we've seen recently is this growth of boycotts in which one set of artists, as we said with the Baillie Gifford case, instruct other artists not to be involved in the festival. Now that starts to turn into bullying. That's inspired by bullying. That's not inspired by I have an opinion, I want to express it. It's I have an opinion and I want you to stop having an opinion. I want to change your mind to such a point that it will limit you. And we've even seen cases in which staff from public funding agencies, have bullied artists that have then presented work in festivals in this country. We've even seen that happening. Where has this come from? And I think there's kind of two parts of that. Firstly, the arts has become an increasingly politicised space. Aesthetic work has given ground to politicised work, so the artist needs to have an opinion on everything, or to come from a political position, or for their work to have a narrative that isn't about technical form development, but is about political positioning or repositioning of the object in our world. So the art schools have become very political places, to the point that art schools don't even necessarily have studios anymore, you know, because you're not actually making anymore, you're thinking. So practice has become very politicised. Curation has become politicised. But I think there's a second issue about the exceptionalism of the artist in our society, and I kind of got two takes on that, because I think it is very, very difficult to be an artist. And I don't just mean financially, although it is very hellish as an artist, you know, financially, it's not easy. But I think to actually present your inner world and your inner ideas into a public forum, and to make that make sense, and to risk people not liking your work, and you've put your name to it. I think there is an act of bravery and exceptionalism about making work and about the artist. But then the flip side of that is the expectation and even the I guess overrating of the artist as the conscience of the country, or having a moral position. And I think that has provided an entitlement to artists which is not credible and can turn into, very quickly, bullying.
Thank you very much. Sorry to hurry you, but the note was to say there's a TV interview here at 4, so we have to get out. So we just, yes, Matilda.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a few disparate remarks to make, especially about cultural boycotts related to Israel. And in the blurb for this session, it mentions the South African apartheid and draws some kind of comparison between that and Israel. And what seems to me particularly pernicious about some of the boycotts relating to Israel is that they seem to target members of Israeli society rather than the Israeli state. And in Israel, as opposed to South Africa, there is a very distinct separation between state and society. There's very vocal opposition to the Israeli state within the society. So I think one of the best examples of this is Sally Rooney refusing to translate her books into Hebrew, which obviously is not really affecting the state of Israel, but is affecting, well, I mean, probably her loss rather than theirs, but it is affecting the Israeli people rather than the government. And I think the reason that some of these boycotts are so popular is because they're very socially and morally rewarding. You get a lot of social clout for doing it, and yet it's a very easy thing to do. And so for mainstream musicians to say they won't perform in Israel, or they're going to withdraw from a certain festival because it's sponsored by arms companies that have relations to Israel, it's no loss for them. Dua Lipa, I think this was at Glastonbury, came out on the stage in support of Palestine and said something along the lines of, I'm going to stand up for Palestine, even if it means my career is going to suffer. I'm thinking, your career is going to be advanced by standing up for Palestine, but it's presented as some kind of very brave thing that you're doing by boycotting Israel. And I think it's quite the opposite. And I also think there's quite a lot of virtue signalling involved in it. And that not much of it seems to be done in good faith, and that just the sheer scale of it suggests to me that this is a conformist movement rather than some kind of expression of political freedom on the part of these artists. And the other issue that I take with this is that it forces the musicians, artists, authors that would have performed in Israel or would have sold their works in Israel into taking a political stance by doing something that they would have done anyway. And I think it's Tom York and Nick Cave that have been the most vocal in opposition to this, and said that by performing in Israel, that's not endorsing the state. It's not a political move at all. It's a political move to withdraw, but it's not a political move to continue doing what you were going to do in the first place. And so that raises more questions for artistic freedom. The artists that are withdrawing their work force the artists into taking a stance. Silence becomes political. Silence is violence. And another slogan that I think is also very pernicious is that ignorance is no excuse. The people partaking in these boycotts don't always seem to know why. You can go talk to people at Palestine encampments or protesting in the streets or on marches, or you can ask artists why they've decided to withdraw their work, and they don't really seem to understand why, and they almost don't want to understand why, and they're almost encouraged not to look into the history of Israel and Palestine. You're supposed to just agree that everyone should be pro-Palestine, and that's the end of the discussion, and it's outrageous for you to say anything otherwise. And seeking any kind of knowledge about this, or suggesting that you oughtn't to have an opinion if you don't have some kind of knowledge about this, that's become quite a controversial and political stance when it really isn't. It's a very apolitical stance to say, I don't know enough about that to have an opinion. So yeah, just some thoughts.
No, thank you very much.